welcome back to Black Indians and Freedmen, the podcast. Welcome back, Dr. Priscilla Dickerson Cousin. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, well, we're going to dig right into chapter 2. So, in what ways are chapters 1 and 2 related? And what did we learn in chapter 1 that would help us better understand chapter 2?
Well, chapter 1 is really laying the foundation for the rest of the book. So chapter 1 looks at how Richard Allen, John Stewart, and Jarena Lee essentially write Indigenous outreach into the denomination. So Richard Allen really begins this process. John Stewart and Jarena Lee continue it, so that by the time you get to the time period of what we see in chapter 2, that is a well-established pattern, that the AME Church is a place where Indigenous people are coming to join and to, as we see in this chapter, become ordained ministers. So in this chapter, you see 2 Indigenous men, the first being Thomas Sunrise, who was Oneida, and the second being John Hall, who was Ojibwe. Both of these men become ordained ministers in the AME Church. And so if not for chapter 1, if you just kind of started at chapter 2, you would say, oh, this is coming out of nowhere. What is happening here? But chapter 1 really sets that stage and shows that really this idea of Indigenous outreach was a part of the AME Church from its inception. And so the ministries of Hall and Sunrise really are just a continuation of that mission.
Okay. All right, well, page 36 begins your background of Thomas Sunrise. So what about his youth, i.e. time period, surroundings, influences, etc., set the stage for his future abolitionist efforts?
Well, Thomas Sunrise really grows up in a period in which the abolitionist movement is, coming into its own. And growing up in New York, he was in many ways surrounded by people who, in the particular area of New York he was in, he was surrounded by people who were, fervent in the abolitionist movement. And so he really grows up in that context. So African Americans who he would have interacted with likely would have been, ardent abolitionists, people who were in favor of abolishing slavery. And so it certainly makes sense that he eventually becomes an abolitionist himself, given that he grew up in that context in New York.
Okay. To give us some historical context, what should readers know and understand about the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 to help us better grasp this chapter?
Yeah, so these are 2 crucial and really painful pieces of legislation that I try to connect in this chapter. So the Indian Removal Act of 1830 was really pushed for by President Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Jackson considered Native people a problem to the expansion of the United States. He viewed the fact that they were still living on their ancestral homelands east of the Mississippi as a problem. The fact that indigenous nations were living in, on some of the most fertile soil in the Southeast, to him, that was a problem. How do we get rid of those people so that white settlers can move on to this land and expand the United States the way he envisioned it? Well, the Indian Removal Act is a part of that. And essentially what it does is it forces, over time, indigenous people living east of the Mississippi River to move west of it. And so, of course, we will see the repercussions of that more in the second half of the book when we look at Indian Territory. But essentially, that's what it does. So then a few decades later, you have the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 that is aimed at making it much easier to recapture African Americans who had run away from their slave masters and made it to the North. Essentially, it empowers the federal government more to go into states and find these people and have them brought back to slavery. So the connection I make here is that although these 2 laws are aimed at different populations, it's still similar. That here you have the federal government intruding into the lives of people who are minding their own business and forcing them to move somewhere or somewhere else. In the case of the Indian Removal Act, forcing indigenous people to leave their ancestral homelands and move west. In the case of the Fugitive Slave Act, it is forcing African Americans who maybe had been free for decades at this point to run for their lives into Canada or to run further north. Or if they are captured, force them back to the South. So both of these are instances of the federal government really intruding into the lives of individuals and trying to force them to move here or there for the benefit of others. And so I see these two experiences connected. This really connects African Americans and indigenous people in this, period that I discuss in the chapter, because they have had this experience of the federal government intruding into their lives and really forcing them to migrate whether they want to or not.
Thank you for that. All right, back to Sunrise. On page 36, you give an account of Sunrise's conversion narrative. What is unique about this narrative, and where do you find evidence of it? And how do you compare it with Richard Allen's conversion as told in his autobiography, Life Experience and Gospel Labors of the Right Reverend Richard Allen?
So Thomas Sunrise talks about his conversion himself. So those are the sources that I used, him talking about it himself. He speaks in the third person, but it's him writing about his experience. And so he describes, the experience really in almost supernatural terms about, seeing a great ball of fire and having all of these really intense experiences. And in this period, it's, common for people who have these conversion experiences to talk about them in this way. I mean, Richard Allen talks about, his experience in kind of a similar way. My dungeon shook, my chains flew off, and glory to God I cried. So that really deep emotional experience. So it was typical of people to explain those times in their lives in this way. And so in that way, Sunrise is very much in line with other religious figures who do something similar. And so it really speaks to how deeply he felt this experience, that he himself is talking about it and expressing it to others. And he is trying to, again, say that this is an experience I had, this is an authentic experience, and this helps to, explain his ministry as he continues over the next few decades.
Okay. On 37, you walk the reader through Sunrise's road to ordination in the AME Church. This road even included stints as pastor in both black and white churches. What factors do you think led Sunrise to the AME Church, and what roadblocks did he encounter on the way to AME ordination, and how were these issues resolved?
Well, this is such an interesting story. Thomas Sunrise is one of the most fascinating people I discovered in the course of my research. So he's converted as a young child. And then by the time we get to the early 1850s, he is already kind of migrating around. He's not pastoring that I've been able to find, but he is visiting and preaching at various churches. So one of the first churches he preaches in 1852, is First African Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia, a very famous and venerable Black church. And so already in the 1850s, he is identifying with Black people. He is choosing to preach to a Black audience. And so this goes back to what I was talking about previously with your other question about the connection between the Indian Removal Act and the Fugitive Slave Act. And I think, although I don't have his, sermon to tell me exactly what he said, I imagine that he was able to draw those similarities, that he knew what it was to have your people uprooted and really pushed in this way and made to feel unwelcome in your own home. And so I would imagine that he felt that commonality with Black people. And so since we know he's in Philadelphia, since we know that he is at first African Presbyterian preaching, I think it's reasonable to then assume that he knew about other Black churches in Philadelphia. So, there's no evidence that he visited Mother Bethel, but it's not impossible, given that he later becomes an African Methodist. So he's already in the 1850s getting introduced to this world of independent Black churches. So eventually he moves to Massachusetts and he pastors a white church, and then eventually becomes, an African Methodist. So he has this really interesting road to the AME denomination, but he had shown early on in his ministry that he was interested in and felt connected to the world of independent Black churches.
Okay. So on page 39, you talk about how Sunrise held a position where he would evaluate other ministers. He also sat on the Committee on Orders. So the question is, what were some of Sunrise's greatest contributions to African Methodism, including the role he played in the formation of the formation of the BME Church? And what other prominent AMEs did he work with?
Yeah, so Sunrise, he becomes an African Methodist in this really critical time. Again, because of the Fugitive Slave Act, the AME Church, some AMEs felt that, the future of this country is just not good for Black people. And they felt that they wanted churches in Canada to just be separate from the AME Church, because they just wanted to have their own denomination, not be in the United States, be safe in Canada. And so eventually you get the establishment of the British Methodist Episcopal Church, or the BME Church, which is, sort of an offshoot of the AME denomination, which was, founded by those AME churches in Canada. And so Thomas Sunrise is there when this is happening. He is able to be a part of the planning of who is going to be the bishop over the BME Church. And so he does this work alongside someone I'm sure you've heard of, Daniel Payne. And he is able to know and interact with these prominent African Methodists and be present in this, critical moment in not only American history, but in AME history, where you have people saying we need to have, the BME Church because there is, no future in this country for African Americans. So he is there in that context. He's able to, get to know fairly well Bishop Nasri, who eventually becomes the bishop of the BME Church. Mm-hmm. And so he does walk in these prominent AME circles.
He's also, according to page 40, he's also affiliated with multiple other denominations outside of the AME Church, including the UBC, the AME Zion Church, and the MEC. So why do you think this happened, and what do you think this does to his AME legacy?
So he has some kind of conflict with some AME ministers in Ohio. So he pastors in Portland, Maine. He travels all over the place. He ends up in Ohio, and he pastors an AME church there. But then from there, he has some kind of conflict with some of the other AME ministers. It's not entirely clear what the conflict was about, but it was enough to make him say, okay, I just need to leave this denomination for a time. And so he does, minister in these other denominations as well. He does come back to the AME denomination years later, which shows that his issue with the AME Church wasn't with its theology or with its existence, but it was just with those particular ministers. He just didn't get along with them in particular. And the fact that he becomes a part of other Black denominations like the AME Zion Church, again, indicates that he maintained his loyalty and his interest and support of Black denominations. But for whatever reason, that conflict with those few ministers in Ohio kind of drove him away from the denomination temporarily. I don't see this as making him less of an African Methodist. I mean, I may feel differently if he had never returned to the AME Church, but he does. Mm-hmm. So I still think all the other points that I make in the chapter are still operable, that he still believes in the importance of independent Black churches. He still believes in the mission of the AME Church and really remains loyal to it, even though he has issues with particular people. And that's not completely unknown in the AME denomination even today, having conflict with, certain people.
Okay. All right. Well, beginning on page 42, you offer more historical context for the time period in which Sunrise lived. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas, the Dred Scott decision, etc. So what role did the AME Church play in abolition?
The AME Church was unapologetically an abolitionist institution. It was, very well established that the AME denomination supported abolition. The church in which you and I grew up, Israel AME Church in Albany, New York, was a stop on the Underground Railroad. You have, of course, what happens with Denmark Vesey in Charleston. You have so many other examples of African Methodists and the AME Church standing up against the institution of slavery. And so there's no way that Thomas Sunrise would have joined this church and not been pro-abolition. It just wouldn't happen. So that history, that real deep belief in abolition, I believe, is what draws Thomas Sunrise to the denomination. It certainly didn't turn him off. If it turned him off, he just would have joined, something else from the beginning. But clearly his abolitionist sympathies were well-founded in the AME Church, and he was able to express them in this denomination in a way perhaps he couldn't have done, or he felt he couldn't have done in a white denomination. So this whole very tumultuous period in American history where the country is really grappling with the issue of slavery and its potential expansion in the West, all of this is an important backdrop to Sunrise's story and helps to explain why he was such an ardent abolitionist, because he, was going through this upheaval and watching it firsthand, and clearly was sympathetic to the plight of African Americans and was willing to throw his lot in with them.
So that leads me straight into my next question. So walk us through the mentality and circumstances of why Native Americans such as Sunrise, Samson Occom, and William Apis became sympathetic to Black struggles. The latter two you discuss on page 43.
As I've mentioned before, Native Americans have their own unique struggles, obviously. They are, the original inhabitants of the country. So as the United States continues to expand, that leads to their displacement and, a host of other different, difficulties. But even though their plight was different than that of African Americans, they still saw that the challenges in some ways were the same. We are people, they wouldn't have called themselves necessarily, we're people of color, Black Indigenous people of color. That's what, kind of the terminology we use, but they would have seen a commonality with people of color that we are suffering and struggling in this society because of what's being imposed upon us. And so although William Apis and Samson Occom, they don't join the AME Church, they certainly express, sympathies and understanding of the challenges that African Americans face. And I believe Thomas Sunrise, he sees that himself. And it's interesting that he's the only one that I've been able to find, at least, who goes beyond sympathizing with Black people to actually joining a Black denomination. So that is what makes him unique among his peers. There are other Indigenous ministers in this period, but that I have found, Thomas Sunrise is the only one who takes the step to actually join a Black denomination. So that makes him really a bit different in taking things a step further beyond just being sympathetic and into actually wanting to be a part of a Black denomination.
Sure. All right. Getting more specific, do we have any specific anecdotes of Sunrise's abolitionist work in Maine or in Ohio? And how were these locations where Sunrise occupied particularly fit for abolitionist work? you detail his abolitionist work on pages 44 through 45.
Yeah, so Thomas Sunrise, his first pastoral charge as an AME minister is in Portland, Maine. And Portland, Maine, just because of its location, because of its proximity to Canada, it was really a hotbed of abolitionist activity. It was a place where people, going on the Underground Railroad would, stop there and then continue their final journey up to Canada. So it really is a place where abolitionist sentiment is strong and where Black churches in particular play an important role in the Underground Railroad. So I don't have any specific documentation saying Thomas Sunrise saved this person and put them on the Underground Railroad because, of course, this is a sort of a clandestine operation. There wouldn't necessarily be a whole lot of documentation for that. But I think it's reasonable to assume that because he is pastoring a Black church in a place that is so critical on the Underground Railroad, I think it makes a lot of sense that he would have been sympathetic to, helpful of, supportive of Black people seeking to either stop in Portland, Maine, or helping them get on further to Canada. In terms of his work in Ohio, because of where he was located, because of its proximity to, people crossing from Kentucky into Ohio, again, he's in a place that is known for assisting people who have escaped slavery or maybe are trying to even make it further north. And so I have one document in which he essentially is advertising a talk that he is giving and where he says that the proceeds are going to go to essentially helping some fugitives. And so that is, one example of him, assisting. But again, because this is meant to be a secretive enterprise, you aren't necessarily going to find loads and loads of evidence of this. But given what he's doing, where he's doing it, I think it makes a lot of sense that he is certainly doing this work.
All right. Well, I love bringing up quotes from your book. So our first quote is on page 46. So please offer further context for this quote. According to Sunrise, Native people were observing white people's treatment, not only of them, but of Black people as well. After witnessing slavery and the collapse of Reconstruction, Native people concluded that white people were insincere Christians with whom they wanted no affinity.
Well, this is one of those documents that helps really make this case for me, that this is not me saying it, this is him saying it. He was making it very clear that on the one hand, you have these white religious institutions trying to convert Native people. And Native people saying, really? So you want us to believe that you are sincere Christians, that you believe in, the equality of all, but at the same time, you are doing all these things. You're treating African Americans this way. You had slavery for all these years. You let Reconstruction, fall apart and, all the aftermath of that and how that affected African Americans. So he's saying very explicitly that we are watching you and we are seeing how you treat Black people. We're seeing how you treat our people. And the only conclusion we can come to is that you don't really mean it when you say that you're a Christian, that you don't really mean it when you say that you were a follower of Jesus Christ. And so it's really an indictment of Christianity that he has seen expressed among whites. And it also helps to, again, explain why he preferred to be among African Americans, because he thought that white Christians were, being hypocritical, and he felt more comfortable among African Americans. So yeah, this is one of those occasions where it is great to have the person you're studying themselves just make that case explicitly as he does.
I understand. All right. We're going to shift to John Hall, and this begins on page 47. And uniquely, you focus on John Hall's personal appearance, including his dress. So why do you think this is something that AME Records mentioned?
AME Records were meticulous. And I'm not surprised to see that expressed in AME Records. John Hall made a point of showing up to AME meetings in Michigan dressed in his, traditional regalia. And he did this, I would imagine, because he wanted to make explicit that I am an indigenous person and I am seeing a connection with African Americans, and I want to make that clear. I want to show that there is this bond between our peoples, and he, says as much in his speeches. And so I think it's also a tactic to ensure that he gets eyeballs. People, for whatever reason, were interested in seeing Native people in their regalia, and they felt that that was, an experience that they wanted to have. And so for him to show up to the meeting in his regalia, it certainly did, cause people to sit up and pay attention. And I imagine that was his object in doing that.
Thank you. On page 47 is the first time you mentioned the Dawes Act of 1887. Please explain what this is and why it is important to understand the world in which Hall lived.
The Dawes Act was passed as a part of a larger civilization program that we want indigenous people to become, good Americans. And part of that is that we no longer want them to hold land in common, as was typical for them, but we want them to have individual plots. We want them to live in nuclear families, and that will help speed them along in the process of becoming, quote unquote, civilized Americans. And so the Dawes Act was intended to divide up indigenous lands into allotments and then have those allotments belong to, individual families as opposed to land being held communally. And so again, that was believed to be a way to make them more American, to think less communally and to think more sort of individualistically. And that would help make them more American and more civilized from that perspective. And it's important to note that Dawes thought that he was doing the right thing. He thought that he was being helpful, that ultimately what Native people need to do is to accept that, their world is gone and they need to enter ours and assimilate in these ways. So from his point of view, he's just helping them to do that. But of course, the result is that Native people lose millions and millions and millions of acres of land, because once all those allotments are, given out, there's a whole lot of land left over. And guess who is now eligible to take that land? And so the result of this allotment policy is really devastating for Native people. And so this is really the world in which John Hall is living and doing his ministry, in the midst of this really aggressive civilization program that is really endorsed by the federal government.
Okay, thank you. On page 48, you mentioned uncertainty about why Hall left the Wesleyan Methodist Church. What theories have you read about the reason behind his departure, and what are your thoughts on why he left?
John Hall speaks to this himself. He says in his speeches to AMEs that he felt spiritually stifled among white Methodists. I'll get the exact quotation wrong, but essentially he says, when I feel emotion and I want to cry or I want to shout, if I were to do that among white Methodists, they would look at me wrong and they would tell me to go away. But with African Americans, with AMEs, with our dear cousins, I feel like I can express myself in that way. So he says himself that he feels more spiritually free worshiping among African Americans than he does among whites, that he feels as if he can't express himself the way he would like to among white Methodists. And so that is part of why he joins the AME denomination. So that's not me saying it, that's him saying it himself.
Yeah, so this bleeds into the next question. So I won't ask it because you really just answered it, but I will read the quote on page 48 from Hall himself. It says, "We are not afraid or ashamed to shout when the Great Spirit comes into our hearts. We cannot do that among the whites. When tears come into our eyes and we want to shout, they say, take them outdoors. So I think that says it all to address your previous answer. All right. So moving on, in what ways did Hall realize the AME Church's vision of indigenous outreach in Michigan and in Canada? Talk about Hall's successes in indigenous outreach, especially in the Isabella settlement. Much of this is discussed on pages 52 through 54.
So Hall himself is from Michigan, and so much of his ministry is in Michigan. He does a bit in Wisconsin, and he also goes to Canada. So he goes to all these various regions. And so what separates him a bit from Thomas Sunrise is that while Thomas Sunrise is evangelizing really in pastoring Black churches, Hall is really going among various indigenous communities and bringing the AME Church there. So in that way, he and Sunrise have a bit of a different ministry. And so Hall, he does see some success. His most successful venture is at the Isabella settlement in Isabella County, Michigan. And, I kind of detail all of that in the book. And again, he goes among these various indigenous communities and speaks to them. And I would imagine just says, I'm from the AME Church, and this is this denomination that is, in support of people like us, and they will give us, assistance and kindness, and we can be more spiritually free among them. And that must have been a powerful message in the context of this, aggressive federal government civilization program that he's saying that, yeah, the federal government is telling us we have to become civilized. We have to behave in this way. White Methodists are telling us we have to behave in this way. But among Black Methodists, we can worship in the way that we feel comfortable. So for those of us who are, interested in becoming Christians, we can do it in a way that's more authentic to us. And so that is really what he's able to offer these communities. And he does see some success. I mean, for specific numbers, you can look to the book, but he does, find some receptive audiences.
All right. Well, our final question ties in our discussion on Sunrise and Hall, and it's best summarized in a quote on page 55. You say, Sunrise and Hall embraced African Methodism and took different paths in their ministries. Sunrise pastored predominantly Black AME churches and became an ardent abolitionist. Hall created small AME congregations among Native communities. So my question is, how should AMEs today view the contributions of Thomas Sunrise and John Hall?
They should view them as an important part of this sort of first century of the AME denomination, that it's just as important as what other ministers were doing in, Philadelphia or Baltimore or any of these other regions, that this is a legitimate part of the first century of AME history, just like anything else. And it speaks to the fact that the denomination, as understood by people in that time period, the denomination was open to marginalized people of color from various backgrounds, including these indigenous people. So it would be one thing if we were just saying there's one Native person in one random place who was interested in the AME Church, but to have both of these ministers in this critical time doing these, doing this interesting and important work, the fact that you also have this in chapter 1, that you had Richard Allen and John Stewart and Jarena Lee doing the ministries that they did. All of it kind of connects together and points to the fact that in this first century of the AME denomination's existence, that there were deliberate outreach efforts to indigenous people, and that people such as Thomas Sunrise and John Hall, they were receptive to them. And not only receptive, but they were willing to become ordained ministers in the denomination and then spread what they learned and spread African Methodism to these various other communities. So it's important to recognize, certainly for the context of this book, because the rest of the book really focuses on Indian Territory in Oklahoma, but also for African Methodists to recognize even today that we shouldn't be surprised. We shouldn't think it is odd for an AME church to be among a community that's not African American. It shouldn't be odd for there to be people of, Hispanic background to be AMEs. It shouldn't be odd to have people from whatever community joining the AME church, because that really is our history. That is what that's just what people did. That's not me making it up. This is what people really did in this first century of the AME denomination. They reached out to various people, and we have this more rich and diverse history than I think we give ourselves credit for sometimes.
Well said. I think that's a perfect place to stop. Thank you for this great discussion, and I look forward to doing chapter 3. So thank you.
Thank you.